But before we begin our second look then at the novel, let's glance for a moment at page 60. Now this is in the Norton Critical Edition that I'm referring to. At the way in which Tolstoy treats, the physical world around him. Now examine what he does with a button. I don't have my copy. Oh, let me borrow. At the beginning of the chapter, let's see if I can see it. When Anna arrived, Dolly was sitting in her little drawing room, giving a fair-haired, plump little boy, who already resembled his father, a French reading lesson. The boy, as he read, kept twisting and trying to pull off a loose button that hung from the jacket. His mother moved his plump little hand away several times, but it always returned to the button. At last she pulled the button off and put it in her pocket. And that's the last we see of the button. Now, if this were Dostoevsky, somebody would have to kill another person with that button. Or at least commit suicide with it. If the author were going to devote that much time to it, you see. And so I think you can see how different the two authors are. This is what we call realism. Tolstoy is giving us just a little realistic detail. A mother not wanting the little boy to pull the button off and lose it, pulls it off, breaks the thread, and puts it in her pocket. And that's the end of it. But it gave us a sense. It gave us a sense of realism. And this is what Tolstoy is so good at. You know, is giving us all of these actions that make the scene come to life. And so you could go on and think about it more and realize that Dostoevsky has a vision kind of like Dante's. That is, for him, everything is an analogy. The whole world is made up of what is called analogical mirrors. People have written articles about the analogical mirrors in Dante that reflect God, reflect the whole universe. So every detail in Dostoevsky is an analogy. Whereas in Tolstoy, things are real in themselves. And we have a strong sense of being present in the scene. And we could say also that Tolstoy is essentially epic. And that Dostoevsky is dramatic. And in a drama, you know, you just have stage props if you need them. You don't have a lot of things around on stage. So Dostoevsky creates scenes, and only the stage props, you know, are necessary to him, because it's mostly dialogue. What he's doing is developing something by means of dialogue, polyphony. So it's hardly necessary for us to agree with George Steiner that one or the other is our favorite. You know, I think we can see how different they are and recognize that both of them are massive and masterful. And so we don't have to prefer one to the other. Now back to that first sentence. Happy families are all alike. What kind of knowledge do we gain from that? And how much is it a kind of clue to the whole attitude of the novel? The great archetypes by which we find our true being, this is saying, are the same the world over. Love and fidelity, sexuality, childbearing, good food, death, grief. These are the shared rhythms of life for which we long most fully, leaving out suffering and death. But we're most satisfied with these great archetypes. And so when a family's happy, then it's alike. In that there's good food, and there's love, and there's inclusion, and there's joy, and there's festivity. But when families are unhappy, they're unhappy in their own way. So when we become too individualized, Tolstoy is saying, too much cut away from the family group, we're unhappy. We're hungry for experience. And yet the family can degenerate into empty forms that promote adherence to external rather than internal standards. And so he's going to show us, with the marriage of Stiva and Dolly, he's going to pose the question to us. Is it better to keep a marriage going as they are when the husband is habitually unfaithful? It's not just one time. See, but he's habitually unfaithful. He honors his wife. He loves his children. He's charming. Is it better to keep that marriage going, or would it be better for Dolly to start looking for a lover? See, now this is a question that she comes up with in the next session of the novel. When you read the last part of the novel, Dolly goes to visit Anna. And she goes thinking, well, my life is not so good. Perhaps I ought to take a lover, But she comes back of a different frame of mind. So Tolstoy is bringing up all of these questions that concern the family, because the family can be stultifying. Now one becomes aware in examining motifs in literature that serious writers are not so much telling us what ought to be as showing us the implications of what is. See, Tolstoy is not just telling us it ought to be this way, but he's making us see that these things exist. They are. What is likely to be under certain circumstances, things that we may not have thought of ourselves, and indeed that we may not be capable of seeing with the clarity of their vision. So we make a mistake when we think an author is promulgating a certain view. If we think he's trying to make us go in that direction. Virginia Woolf once said that if after reading a novel we have the impulse to write a check to our favorite charity, then that means it was a bad novel. So even Tolstoy, who was a kind of preacher, in life, but even he, in his great writings, his novels, is really simply trying to tell us what is. He's trying to get at those archetypes that operate. And I think he certainly leaves many of them open to question. Now we fail many times to recognize that writers and poets have the kind of authority in their work because it's as though they're conducting an experiment. It's as though they're saying, let's put a little of this in here and a little of this and see what happens. Now, we are not likely to think that their findings have the kind of authority that scientists do. But I think we ought to, in their own way. If a writer writes a great novel, he has demonstrated some truths to us. They've observed human behavior carefully. They're essentially impersonal in that they present to us in a formed vision the insights that they've discovered through their art. They're not evaluating persons as much as actions. So in the end, we're not really supposed to say Anna was a bad woman or Anna was a good woman. we're supposed to see her action and think about the ambiguity of that action. The persons are needed to make the actions clear. All right, Dostoevsky. Now, looking back a moment at him, he's saying, like the Christ of the New Testament, that not so much the family as the community is the arena of our sharing. See, Tolstoy is taking the archetype of the family, which is essentially a pagan view. Now, when I say pagan, I don't mean secular, because Tolstoy was very religious. But in my view, he was pagan. That is, he saw the great forms in nature, and he saw the way, the symbols of what those forms point to, and he's very much on the side of morality, you know, in the way that the great pagans were. Whereas Dostoevsky, it seems to me, has that strange, distorted view that the Christian always turns out with. You know, the Christian builds gargoyles on his cathedrals, and he doesn't have that symmetrical view of things. As the Misfit says in one of Flannery O'Connor's stories, you remember Jesus thrown everything off balance, you know. And so think about that a little, because, and you may not agree with me on it, but it just seems to me that the Christian vision of grace operating in the world, which is like an electrical current, you know, it's real, it's not imaginary, it upsets everything. And so the fine classical order that we inherited from the Greeks is upset by the Christian view. And I'm speaking aesthetically here. So in Dostoevsky's novels, think of Raskolnikov and Sonia and their salvific union, and how essentially grotesque it is. It's not within the family. You see, the family has been a drawback for both of them. And then think of the urgency of finding a bridegroom for Nastasia, the prince's failure in this regard. So we don't have a bridegroom, we don't have a marriage. And then think of Stepan and Barbara's avoidance of marriage. Now we have marriage in Shatov and his wife. In fact, we have an image of the Holy Family with that baby being born and the father not being the father of the child, and yet loving him. And yet it doesn't last. So it doesn't seem to be what Dostoevsky thinks is going to be the way for society. And then think about the bad marriages of Fyodor, the chaste passion between Dmitri and Grushenka. But none of those seem to be the way that Dostoevsky says things are going to go, if they go rightly. It's Alyosha's way that he seems to think is the right way. And, incidentally, apparently, Alyosha will marry Lisa. But we have the feeling that if they do marry, that it's not going to be turning in on themselves with happiness, you know, between them. It's going to be a work in the world. It's going to be facing the world, the two of them. Because he says to her, you think like a martyr. You remember? And then think of the marriage feast at Cana, which is the dominant symbol in the brothers Karamazov. It's the vision that Alyosha had. Now we're caught in our civilization between the visions that these two great writers depict. One has been colored by the Roman sense of the enclosed, protected family. See, that's Roman. With the paterfamilias supposedly in the major role. And this is Levin's ideal. See, he loves Kitty, and he learns from her. But it's obvious that Levin is the boss in that family. He's the pater familias. And in the other, the brothers Karamazov, the outgoing drive of an Alyosha, who will use his marriage as a center for a concern for all that will issue in actions to alleviate the suffering of the world. See, Levin isn't trying to alleviate the sufferings in the world. Levin is going to be the ideal of the agrarian farmer with a homestead, a good marriage. So you need to see these things from the novels because I think they have a way of telling us something. But the enclosed Roman sense of the family has become in modernity, and there have been many books written on this, a haven in a heartless world. That's the name of one of the books. And it's become too enclosed. That happened really under Queen Victoria in Victorian times when the family withdrew from that terrible world out there and made its own little kingdom within itself. It was too much protective of its members, too uniform in its desire for unity. So the result can be something like Dolly and Steva's marriage, where empty forms prevail. And the antidote to this kind of apparently meaningless marriage, we're told in many books and by many scholars from the 19th century on, the antidote for this meaningless marriage has been adultery. And in our time, the single life. There are lots of people that are deciding not to be married. Now, the 19th century novel disclosed in the works of Flaubert and Meredith and Hawthorne and Hardy and James, among others, a horrified awareness that feminine sexuality exists and that its presence is often incompatible with existing moral and religious structures. Judith Armstrong, I've mentioned her before, wrote a book called The Novel of Adultery. The myth of romantic love reappears in 19th century novels. She speaks of adultery in courtly love terms. And she says it's in literature that myths reappear when they've lost their sacred nature. And the myth that she's talking about that reappears is that myth of romantic love from the Middle Ages, the courtly love. The feminine myth, then, has been under question for some time, and Tolstoy is dealing with that in his novel Anna Karenina. And we said last time that Anna is a great-souled woman. She's large enough in her scope to be a tragic heroine. She commits the terrible deed that the tragic hero commits. Hubris. She chooses against her marriage for a relationship based on passion. And similarly, Levin, the protagonist in the counterplot, is looking for the great archetypes of human feeling, just as Anna is. But he doubts their possible genuineness, and he is extremely moral. So thus the first section of the novel delineates the cohesive nature of marriage and the destructive energies of passion. Marriage can stand the light, meaningless affairs of a Steva, the novel seems to say. These are sins that can be forgiven, but it can't permit a serious commitment of the soul outside the bounds of marriage, a commitment which redirects its priorities. And in the 19th century, society in the Western world, including Russia, was on the side unequivocally of marriage. Society has the ability to ostracize. That's the power that it has. What this means is that one is cut off from the normal activities of life that come to one because of one's station. You know, public affairs, parties, concerts, sometimes church attendance, informal visits, and most serious of all, the domestic life with children. So these are the issues, among many others, that Tolstoy brings up in this grand novel, this novel that has so much scope to it. Now, we talked last time about Anna's choice to let herself give in to the kind of experience that sweeps a person off her feet, to let herself be for herself. See, that's what the choice is. It's, you know, and nowadays people are busy saying, I deserve this, you know. And if you ask them, why do you deserve it? You know, they don't have any real reason except I'm a human being, you know. I'm an individual, and so I deserve happiness. So Anna is feeling that she wants to be for herself, to be worshipped. She begins finding, of course, that there are bonds, which one has a hard time ignoring. Bonds to husband, child, household, friends, public opinion, and deep-lying moral laws. Now, the great writers indicate to us that there are, whether we recognize them or not, things that I've called invisible presences. That sounds like too fancy a term, but I can't think of a better one, except maybe the pieties. The things that people have piety toward. You remember, no, which one? This one. You remember Aeneas with his great virtue of pietas, which really means not just piety in the sense that we use the word. It means a kind of reverence for things. And one must have this pietas for one's city, for one's father, mother, wife, friends. And so it seems to me that in dropping this great virtue, because modern people in our century, tend to think that this is a kind of non-virtue. You know, that if you love your country, you're likely to be blind to what's going on in it. You know, and if you love anybody in charge of anything, you're helping power along. The great theme now, you know, is an attack on power. And the assumption is that power is of itself bad. So we're all taught not to have this feeling of reverence for our leaders, for our presidents. You know, look what we put all our presidents through on both parties. It's not just one, but look back at our record. It's appalling, it seems to me, what we do to the person in the highest political office in the land. But we think it's right to do it, apparently. We think that we have to be honest and stringent about these things. So we don't let anybody be sheltered by a pietas. But we can't get away from what I'm calling these invisible presences. And these are the great moral imperatives that we think we can do away with. You know, when Hitler signed the document that gave way to the final solution, you know, he thought no one was there to criticize him. He was free to do it. But there were invisible presences in the room with him. You see, they were there. And they tracked him down like the Furies. You know? So there are those great moral laws that are invisible, but that we can't destroy. Antigone calls them the high-footed laws. That's one translation of what she says. She really means those laws that are based from on high. And so she's got to be loyal to her brother and has to break the law because it's a higher priority to have this reverence for your brother. And she goes on, and I never have understood this exactly, but she goes on to say that the brother You have to be, more loyal to your brother than you would to your mother or your father. No. And her reasoning is that, what is it? I forgot. Something about, I was going to say that you can't have any more brothers, but you certainly could, couldn't you? So I never have understood that part of Antigone. But at any rate, she's pretty convincing that she believes it, isn't she? And so there are those invisible qualities that we can't do away with. Now, another thing that they're called, Roman Ingarden, Ingarden, is a Polish literary critic who's very fine, and he's written a book called Theory of Literature, and he talks about metaphysical qualities. And he defends literature by saying that it makes clear to us those metaphysical qualities that life contains, but life doesn't give us a chance to analyze them. Because when something of great import is happening to us, we are so overwhelmed that we can't know the experience. A great grief, we can't really know it. We can't explore it because it overwhelms us. And so Ingarden is saying that what literature does is to make clear those metaphysical qualities. I guess all the writers that we know of that are serious about this have their own name for it. Faulkner just simply calls them the old verities. And he's pretty sure that we can't really destroy them. So it's that we look for in our writers. And when we find writers who are writing, as many of them are today, who act as though life has no dimensions to it, that it's simply flat, sensual experience with none of this transcendence at all, then we know that that's not very good literature. It isn't just that we disapprove of it morally, but it doesn't really give us the fullness of its subject. So with Anna, what Tolstoy does is find that these invisible qualities that she decided to flout do her in. Now, they wouldn't in our society today. You see, so these invisible qualities express themselves differently in each day, but they're there. And then many of us think they don't change all that much. So she begins finding that there are bonds which one has a hard time ignoring. Bonds to husband, child, household, friends, public opinion, and those deep-lying moral laws. So Tolstoy, socialist though he was in his nonfiction writing, and revolutionary in many ways as he was in his novels a deeply conservative defender of the pieties. Because we can tell that he thinks what Anna did, though he treats her with dignity, but we can tell that he thinks this is a wrong path. And he has to give us Levin to show us what the right path is. One question that we have to ask ourselves about Tolstoy, though, if we are to understand him completely, is does he see these qualities as the postmodern cultural critics see them, as invented by the human? Or does he think they are in the nature of being itself? Now that, I think, is the large question that we need to ask. Remember that he prefaces the novel with a quotation from Romans. Vengeance is mine. I will repay. And then we know the line goes ahead to say, saith the Lord. So you might turn back to, I think if you have the Norton Critical edition, you have a footnote that has a little commentary on that. And I think there are things in the back of your text about it also. So you might be thinking about why Tolstoy used that quotation from Paul and how it applies to this novel. All right, in opposition to the disastrous development of Anna's disregard for the pieties in her search for personal happiness, then Tolstoy had to give us Levin. And we know that he wrote that later. You know, he had to add that story. His is the path of learning. He's simple and yet intellectual, honest and yet idealistic, sensual, suspicious of forms and ritual. You know, he's a bit like Bazarov. And yet he's full of respect for what he considers the higher things of life. He's afraid of death. And if we had more time to deal with Tolstoy, I was going to have you read his short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I was going to talk to you about Tolstoy's own personal fear of death, because it dated from a very specific time in his life, and I wanted us to look at some of the stories he had written, because it isn't just a normal fear of death, it's a horror of it. And I think it's because he was tempted strongly to see nothing beyond this life. You see that this life is all. And if you get a glimpse of life in that way, then death is a horror. And so he couldn't get it out of his mind. And it permeated so much of his work. And I think by the time he wrote Anna Karenina, he had dealt with it. But he had to give this quality to Levin, because Levin is like, in many ways, the young Tolstoy. He's suspicious of forms and ritual, and yet he's full of respect for what he considers to be the higher things of life. He's self-deprecative. I don't think Tolstoy was that. With a feeling of ineptness, he has pride, but he has genuineness and an ability to love. Now, we saw a vignette last time that depicted his essential clumsiness, for which he, however, compensates, and that's that skating image. We observed then in the mowing scene his persistence, his willingness to learn, his final awkward union of body and spirit. And now when he sees Kitty passing by in a carriage out in the country, and he had decided, you remember, that he might as well marry a peasant girl and just settle down to his agrarian life because there was work to do. But he looks in that carriage, sees a young woman in it, and their eyes meet, and it's Kitty. And he knows that there's no face like that in the world. There are no eyes like that in the world. And so we see in him that wholehearted outpouring of genuine love, that erotic joy that has marked the masculine response to woman in the Western world. Now, this is not romantic passion. This is a genuine eros. You know, it is passionate, but it is based on genuineness. It is not an illusion. And the way I'm using that idea of romantic passion in this class is that it's an idealization of a situation so that one thinks one can rise above the ordinary and be transported and rapturous the whole time. People forget when they think that that's possible. They forget how tiring it is to be with another person all the time. You know, that you have to give each other a bit of space, you know. And so I think that's what Anna and Vronsky find. And Vronsky Blonsky doesn't want to admit it. He doesn't want to admit that he's bored with Anna. But I think he is. So romantic passion tends to be self-centered. And eros is other-centered. You see, when you really, and this is a masculine thing, as I'm saying, and I'm not speaking moralistically on this. It just seems to me that aesthetically, from great literature, we see that it is the masculine drive that is that passion of joy at the other, and then the return of that, the agape, seems more feminine. But this may be an old-fashioned way of speaking of all this. But the scene in which Levin meets Kitty's eyes in the carriage depicts for us that wholeness, that joy that comes from finding his other half. And then as the novel develops, we shall see Levin's willingness to be instructed by Kitty. When he and she visit his dying brother, for instance, she knows more how to deal with a sick person. He is repulsed by the way his brother looks in the last stages of dying of tuberculosis. He doesn't want to be around his brother. And Kitty, this little delicate thing, marches right in there like a general commanding an army, and cleans that room up and makes the dying man comfortable. And a kind of look of happiness comes on his face from this little girl that Levin had been thinking he had to protect. You see, that's one of the best scenes in the novel, it seems to me, is the way Kitty takes over with illness. So he learns from her. But in general, what this open, seeking person, Levin, learns from loving a genuine and warm young woman is an enlarged understanding. See, he learns aspects of life that he would not have learned before, that comes through her. So he's been made complete. Look at page 361, for instance, where Levin becomes suddenly aware of the difficult situation of unmarried young women. This is at Dolly's house, and they've been discussing the issue of what unmarried women should do. And in those days, the only thing that an unmarried young woman could do was to live with a family and be known as an old maid. And so he's always just taken that for granted. He hadn't thought about it before. And yet, we're told, look at what we read there, and he understood all that Pestov at dinner had been trying to prove about the freedom of women, simply because he saw in Kitty's heart fear of the humiliation of being an old maid, and loving her, he too felt that fear and humiliation, and at once gave up his contention. So he's learning from this other half of himself. And of course, Kitty has much to learn. Now, Levin has been unintentionally self-centered. He's passed judgment on everything and thinks his opinion is the most important in the world. But he's essentially a generous person. On page 362, we witness the young couple's charming reconciliation with their writing initial letters on a table and understanding each other. Now, would you have been able to understand that? I'm afraid I'd have missed the love of my life if it depended on it. So we have WYAICNBDYMFON. And let's see, who's saying that now? Oh, that's Levin asking her. And she knows that what it says is, when you answered, it cannot be, did you mean then or now? And her reply is TICNAA. Then I could not answer NAO. Then I could not answer otherwise. Now that's a little hard to believe, isn't it? I think that otherwise is a little hard to take. And And she goes on then to say that you might forgive and forget what happened. So they understand each other. The miracle has occurred. It's what we call falling in love. See, now they've been ready for it. And Levin has already loved her from a distance. And we might think Kitty is just being convenient about it because she was smitten with Vronsky and that failed. And so now she's taking second best, we might think. But I think Tolstoy makes us see that this is not the way it is. Levin, of course, is overjoyed. They're immediately reconciled. They're aware that they love each other. She promises to tell her parents in the morning. Levin then has 14 hours to pass before seeing her again. He goes to the town council meeting with Kuznetsov and afterwards stays in his room, unsleeping. He can hardly bear to wait. At about 6 in the morning, he begins to hear movements in the street. He washes, dresses, and rushes to the Sherbatsky's house, and everyone is still sleeping. And now he must wait at least another 2 hours. And then the omniscient narrator, now remember we've got an omniscient narrator in this novel that knows everything. And the omniscient narrator tells us about how Levin spent the hours before coming back to Kitty's house. This is on page 366. Let's read it together. All that night and morning, Levin had lived quite unconsciously and felt quite outside the conditions of material existence. He had not eaten for a whole day, had not slept for 2 nights, had spent several hours half-dressed and exposed to the frost. And yet he felt not only fresher and better than ever before, but quite independent of his body. So he's not eaten, he's not rested, he's been in a transport, and he feels great. He was sure that he could fly upwards or knock down the corner of a house. And what he then saw, he never saw again. 2 children going to school, some pigeons that flew down from the roof, and a few loaves put outside a baker's window by an invisible hand touched him particularly. These loaves, the pigeons, and the 2 boys seemed creatures not of this earth. It all happened at the same time. One of the boys ran after a pigeon and looked smilingly up at Levin. The pigeon flapped its wings and fluttered up, glittering in the sunshine amid the snow dust that trembled in the air. From the window came the scent of fresh-baked bread as the loaves were put out. All these things were so unusually beautiful that Levin laughed and cried with joy. Now notice, now that's what we call an image. You see, all your senses, or nearly all of them, are involved. Notice Tolstoy's magnificent ability to render an image. See, look at the senses, the bread, which we can smell and vicariously taste, the glitter of the pigeon's wings, the sound of the boy playing, shouting, sight, sound, smell, touch. The only one omitted is taste, and it's implied, as I've said, in loaves of bread. And notice how different an image is from an icon. Compare the iconic moment of Alyosha's memory of his mother. To Dostoevsky, the scene was spiritual, not physical. Material being was lifted up into an abstract design. See, now that's the important thing about an icon, is that it's design-like. An abstract design that speaks to the spirit. To Tolstoy, the very materiality of the things gives them meaning. Now, all those things that we touch and taste and hear and smell, They do not have to make a higher design. The senses are sufficient glorification for them. Now, both of these visions are splendid. Both celebrate existence, but they are two polar opposites in the rendition of actuality. You see, Dostoevsky never gives us a full-bodied, imagistic scene in which we're so much aware of the materiality of things. And Tolstoy doesn't give us the transcendence of the icon. Now, Tolstoy's image makes us understand what Ezra Pound meant when he spoke of an image as not just a picture in words, but the presentation of an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. Or the presentation of an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. Now, it seems to me this is exactly what Tolstoy has done with this elevated sensitivity that Levin has, so that when he looks, they're not having eaten and feeling bodiless, like a disembodied spirit. All of these things take on a beauty and a glory and a radiance, that he never saw again, we're told, in life. So I would amend Ezra Pound's definition just a bit. I guess I'd add to it. And I'd say that it's the presentation of material objects in language in such a way that they convey what he says, an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. So an image is the presentation of material objects in such a way that they convey an intellectual and emotional complex at one moment. And I would go on to suggest that an iconic image in language is the presentation of material objects in such a way that they point beyond themselves to an invisible order. So think about Alyosha's memory of his mother holding him up as a baby to the icon, and the madness on their part, the distraughtness and the benevolence of the Blessed Mother looking down. And none of it is rendered just to realize the senses, but it's to give us that pattern, that design that speaks of something metaphysical. Now, we don't really have to prefer one writer to the other, as Steiner said. We should actually appreciate them both, for the genius of both has set a path for the novel. See, I think these two, between them, have really determined so much of the 20th century novel, particularly in the Third World. People are writing their myths and their memories down, their racial memories, as technology is destroying their culture. They're writing these large novels that I think Tolstoy and Dostoevsky gave them the inspiration for. And so they've set a path for the novel, I'm saying, that has saved it from the commodification and the skepticism of modernity, and may enable the novel to save a civilization. See, now that's a crazy thing to say, isn't it? But if we think that the Iliad, in a way, formed a civilization, and many great authorities think so, then it seems to me that these novels, could carry those invisible qualities that would be enough to save a civilization that seems headed for disaster. And indeed, as I've said, the novel has gone hand in hand with technology into the countries that are being westernized. And their stories and their mythologies are being preserved by their younger generation in those countries, among which are those who are reading and writing novels. Now when Kitty approaches, and this is page 368, this is after he's had his transcendent experience of the loaves of bread and the pigeons and the boys running, making that unforgettable image of joy. And finally, he can go to her house and know that they're up and the day has started. And so when she approaches on page 368, Levin heard the sound of very, very rapid, light steps on the parquet floor. And his joy, his life, his own self, the best in himself, that which he had sought and yearned for so long, advanced very, very rapidly toward him. She too had not slept all night and had waited for him the whole morning. Kitty's father, the old prince, is so obviously pleased that Kitty's embarrassed. The old man kisses her face, her hand, then her face again, and makes the sign of the cross over her. And Levin has a new feeling of affection for this man who had been strange to him before. But when he sees how long and tenderly Kitty kissed his fleshy hand, he felt differently about Kitty's father. Now this is a magnificent rendering of the way in which love expands the person. See, that's what it's supposed to do. And so many times we see that it narrows a person because they become jealous. They don't want the beloved to have any connections besides those with themselves. But those who love generously love through the other person's affections rather than feeling threatened by them. We've had a series of comic films recently, haven't we, about the dire situation of young persons that are being introduced to their intended families, you know, that are either of another race or another something or other, and it's always comic and full of disasters. So these films are all based on the modern tendency not to love, not to reach out and include, but to draw the lines of resentment and exclusion. Now, what does this signify? Do you think these films are an indication of a greater tolerance in our society because the problem is so much written about? Or is it the opposite? You know, have we become more tight in our connections? At any rate, Levin is joyously accepted by Kitty's family, who had been, of course, worried about the Vronsky business. And Levin and Kitty will step into traditional roles, and their love, in contrast with the passion of Vronsky and Anna, is within human bounds. You know, it's not angelic or demonic. It's the kind that has as its end marriage, a sacrament which is given as a gift. Now, Levin has long ago discerned in Kitty his heart's desire. He's had time for his soul to know her and to make her precious. See, and that's what we do when we love someone. We're responsible for our own loves, you know, because we have to take the person into our hearts and cherish that person and endow them with a greater appreciation than we might have given them at first. And she, on the contrary, has had to be awakened to his love. He's had time to think about her and to keep her in his heart. When a young woman herself falls in love first, it's likely to be with a romantic dream, in the way that Emma Bovary falls in love with a dream, in the way that Kitty does with Vronsky, not really knowing him, but attributing to him extraordinary qualities that seem to signify glamour and eternal delight. So Kitty has had to have her eyes opened. She's had to learn to love by being loved. And hence she learns the connection between love and will. And as soon as she's aware of the force of genuine love and commits herself to it, she's a changed person. Tolstoy makes us see that two people can find in each other their other selves, can come together in a marriage union that will increasingly deepen and grow richer because it's based on a true I-thou relation, one that does not seek to conquer the other are to possess it, the other, but to unify and enrich. Now, to explain the suddenness of Kitty's and Levin's certainty that they love each other, let's consider the situation a moment. You see, because it looks pretty hurried, the whole thing, particularly for her. After her disastrous experience of thinking that she was in love with Vronsky, and now finding that the one who preceded Vronsky in her affections, Levin, has forgiven her rejection of him, Kitty has turned her will toward loving Levin. See, she's set her will on it. She's thought about him, she's retrieved him in her memory, and she loves him now. He had long ago given his will to loving her. When one decides to love someone, the will focuses the whole person on the beloved object. And that object becomes dearer and dearer because of what Tolstoy would consider the divine mystery in the very nature of things. See, and this is what people have forgotten nowadays when we think about marriage and the disastrous percentage of divorces. And I look back over my 50 years of teaching, and some of the young, idealistic Catholic youngsters that were extremely, extremely moral are divorced now several times. So it's an epidemic that's affecting everyone, and I think it's primarily because of something that Tolstoy shows us here, is because we've ignored that we set our wills to love someone, and they become more precious because we love them. So this awareness of the deep life of things is not simply a kind of blanket goodness and virtue spread over everything. It's a genuine dimension of reality. So in Tolstoy's view, marriage is work, not as Dostoevsky would have said, by divine infused grace, but by a deep life in materiality itself. If one sets one's will, I should say deep life in nature itself. If one sets one's will to love another and gives one's life to the task, Tolstoy is indicating that person becomes all the dearer. And so the bond is indeed then indissoluble. So literature, I think, teaches us how to envision this kind of turn in ourselves, since it educates the imagination and the heart. Literature is not trying to educate our minds. It's not giving us ideas. It's attempting to give us what St. Augustine called the ordo amoris, the order of our loves. You see, in the modern world, no one has paid any attention to our feelings and our emotions. Ever since the beginning of modernity, it's been fact and measurability, empiricism and rationality that has mattered. And so what we have is people who, as Chesterton and as C.S. Lewis have said, people that are all head, with no chest. And so Tolstoy is showing us, I think, that in the nature of things, in the order of our loves, we can find that fidelity within ourselves. And literature teaches us by analogy how to make this turn in ourselves. So Anna and Vronsky, we are meant not just to condemn, but to understand, because we see that they are incredibly selfish, incredibly set on self-gratification above all else. And we have to think back, as I tend to do always in the whole literary tradition. If Dido had been able to compel Aeneas to stay with her, this is what their lives would have been like after that first year. An ever-narrowing circle of concern, with Aeneas knowing that he had neglected his own mission and increasingly unable, by means of sexual passion alone, to make up the loss of the other categories of existence. But Levin's and Kitty's marriage presents some freedom from each other. See, that's what Anna and Vronsky don't have. They have to be absolutely intense every moment of their lives because she has given up everything in her life. He has to make it up. He has given up his commission, his military calling. He's given up his association with his male friends. He's given up everything, so she has to be everything to him. And people get tired of each other. They get worn out with each other. And Levin and Kitty have a work so that they have some freedom from each other. And Levin finds to his surprise that the gentle Kitty is surprisingly tough. And I've referred to that scene. It's a wonderful scene that we won't have time to get to tonight, of the sick brother, the dying brother, and the way in which Kitty elevates his spirit, makes him more comfortable, makes him more reconciled to things, by coming in and cleaning up and sprinkling cologne water on the bed. And so Levin is amazed at it. Now, incidentally, after the brother dies, and he receives the last sacraments, and gets better for a while, but he's dying, and it's a long, tedious process. And so after he's dead, they discover that Kitty is pregnant. So this is Tolstoy's art as a novelist, that death and life, death and new life come together at that moment. The whole novel is constructed with this kind of amazing symmetry. Now to look at Anna's husband a bit more closely. He's built his life on prudence. Is it time for a break? Not, is it? No. He's built his life on prudence, on calmness, on clarity and justice. We know that he disapproves of Steva's infidelity to his wife. And we're told that Anna was aware of this quality in her husband, his sticking to moral principles, and that she liked it. See, we can't go against what the author himself says. She was aware that her husband had high moral principles and stuck to them, and she liked it. When others in his circle start gossiping about his wife and Vronsky, Karenina thinks it will be sufficient to warn Anna that she's giving scandal. See, he's such a moral person himself and has such a code of right behavior that he thinks if he just tells her, people are talking about you, you know, that she would modify her behavior. But when she's not honest with him, he can't fall back on their usual discourse together. And a note of falsity begins to be injected, not only then in what Anna says, but it infects him also, her husband's comments too. He's forced into playing a role, and hence his assumption of dignity becomes even more pronounced. It still seems, however, that he could merely warn her of the consequences, since he wants to treat her as a rational, responsible person in her own right. And besides, as he thinks, the powers that be are all on his side. They're all on the side of marriage. Society's good opinion approves of marriage and motherhood. But after the scene at the racetrack, when Karenina can't ignore the situation and confronts his wife, a tactic which results in her openly admitting her love for Vronsky. See, he wasn't prepared for that. He didn't expect it. He thought she would be abashed, you know, to know that she was creating a scandal. But when she said, you know, all right, I love him and I hate you, you know, then what can he do about it to keep up this kind of gentlemanly detachment that he's wanted to have because he's wanted to be fair? So he's understandably taken aback and nonplussed about how to act. He intends to be magnanimous and not stoop to jealousy. But Tolstoy makes us see how impossible this posture is. The dissolution of faith in a marriage affects not only one's dearest affections, but one's position in society, and even one's daily routine. For Tolstoy is showing us in Anna Karenina the complicated architecture of marriage, and the way in which it's tied in with not only the individual, but the whole of society. He has written at a time when the institutions in Western culture are beginning to weaken and to show signs of breakage. And so we have to read the novel as he has written it in order to obtain from it its value as a concrete universal. Our personal opinions and our situations are beside the point for us as readers. If we ourselves happen to be divorced, or to believe that divorce is justified when one falls in love with someone else, that's something separate from ourselves as readers. Now, do you believe that? It seems to me that's what we have to aim at, is that we separate our own experience from our experience as readers of a novel. And so as readers of a novel, we have to see with Tolstoy how fearfully serious a marriage is. So we should be able to give our imaginations to the profound instruction that this novel contains. Its attempt to get back to archetypes, and that profundity will not be gained by liking or disliking a character. We have to see and understand the intention of the work, the motivation of all the fictional creatures given us by the author. So though we may think him less than ideal, certainly we can empathize with a man, Karenin, who has lived his life by rational standards, has been successful, and who has it suddenly revealed to him that his wife does not love him, that she's having an affair with someone she does indeed love, and that she has no intention of ending the affair. As Wasiolik has written, her love is the eruption of something almost demonic. Now, I've been saying angelic because it's trying for a transcendence that makes it above ordinary experience. Karenin tries to be magnanimous. He goes to his friend the Countess for advice. He becomes over-pious, but despite all his dullness, he's a decent man in despair. Everyone's made worse by Anna's and Vronsky's passion. Not only Karenin, but the lovers themselves. They're pitiably reduced in stature. And finally, Seryosha, the son that Anna gives up. We can only get a glimpse of him, but we see how his life has been affected. Now, foreshadowing first the crushing of the peasant. Tolstoy uses these devices of dreams and portents in order to foreshadow something that is going to happen. So the crushing of the peasant on that first train trip that both of them are on when they're going to Moscow. And then Anna's hallucination in the snowstorm, which is one of the magnificent things in this novel, a surrealistic feeling with the snow covering everything and closing her in, and she's been trying to read, and that's when she begins to entertain the idea of listening to Vronsky. And her hallucination in that sense, that scene, is of a peasant hammering on iron. And then on page 324, we have Vronsky's dream, his continuing disillusionment with himself. On page 326, we're told that he knows their joy is in the past. See, it's out of duty now. You feel for him, because he was a man who had a military career. He was in high society, of a good family. he was wanting to stay unattached. And it was thought perfectly proper, for one in that position, to have affairs, most of the time with married women, because you didn't want to get married yourself if you were in that position. And he thought of himself as a decent person, and here he is in this position that if he lets up at all with Anna, he will feel like a bounder. You know, he'll feel like someone who has betrayed her. And so they put pressure on each other that is almost intolerable. On page 328, Anna has an intuition about her coming death. And she says, I know it. She's pregnant. She says, I know it, and I know it for certain, and I'm very glad that I shall die. I shall find deliverance and deliver you. She goes on, I've had a dream. And she describes running into her bedroom and finding someone there, a peasant with a rough beard, small and dreadful. I wanted to run away, she says, but he stooped over a sack and was fumbling about in it. Now this will recur at the end of the novel. She showed how he fumbled in the sack, and her face was full of horror. And Vronsky, remembering his dream, then knows that something ominous, something horrible is suggested. And Anna continues. He fumbles about and mutters French words so quickly, and with a burr, you know. Il faut le battre, le faire, le broyer, le pétrir. It's necessary to beat the iron, to pound it, to knead it. I began asking myself what it could mean. And Corny says to me, you will die in childbirth. In childbirth, ma'am. And then I woke. So she misinterprets the dream, because as we find out by the end of the novel, the dream is pointing to some other end for Anna. She doesn't die in childbirth. So Tolstoy indicates in these dreams and in the image of Anna's death an uncanny, psychological, and supernatural omen. Anna does not die in childbirth. Something much worse happens. Karenina is outraged when he encounters Vronsky in his own house, because this was the one thing that he said. He would tolerate everything else, but Vronsky was not to come to their house. So Anna had not fulfilled his condition, and he was obliged to punish her and carry out his threat to divorce her and take away her son. This is on page 330. And Anna, who thought she knew her husband so well, was struck by his appearance when he entered. He avoids looking at her, and his voice was different. And she says, I've not seen this new trait of cruelty in you before. So I think Tolstoy makes us see that all of the people in this are made worse by it. Vronsky's made worse, Anna's made worse, Karenina's made worse, and certainly who's going to leave out? There ought to be 4. All right, she goes on to speak of his baseness, her husband's baseness. Baseness, he replies, since you wish to use that word, and this is page 331, it's baseness to abandon a husband and a son for a lover, and to go on eating the husband's bread. Her head drooped. She did not say what she'd said to her lover the day before, that Vronsky was her real husband, and that he, Karenin, was superfluous. She did not even think it. She felt all the justice of his words, and only said softly, you cannot describe my position as being worse than I know it to be. So he can call her to a kind of moral awareness. You know, she knows that it is dishonorable, and she admits it. Now, Karenina admits that her actions have hardened his heart, that he can't even feel for his son what he should feel, but that nevertheless he will see to it that she does not have him. But all this is changed then by Anna's near-death experience. She does indeed come very near dying in childbirth, and the experience changes her. On page 373, she sends for her husband. And the midwife says on page 374, "Thank God you have come. She talks only about you and nothing but you." So she's turned back to her husband, and on the very verge of death, she wants to see Karenina. When Karenina goes to Anna's bedside, Vronsky is there, and he greets Karenina, telling him she's dying. The doctors say there's no hope. I'm entirely in your hands. So he's feeling terribly guilty and obliged to Karenina. But allow me to remain here, please. However, I'm in your hands. Suddenly, Karenina is in control. Vronsky is made to realize that in matters of life and death, the legally responsible person, the husband, has the authority, both actual and moral. Karenina finds a changed Anna. She's flushed and agitated. She remarks on how strange and terrible that both her husbands are called Alexei, and she keeps wanting Karenina to come to her. "He's so kind," she says. "No one knows how kind he is but me. You say you won't forgive me because you don't know him. No one knows him, only I. One must know his eyes. Seryosha's are just the same. That's why I can't bear to see them." Anna feels she must hurry before she dies to reconcile the two Alexeis. Now I understand everything. Over Karenina's drawn face came a look of suffering. Anna looks at him with tenderness, saying that there's another woman in her and that she's afraid of her. So the indication is that Anna feels she has discovered her real self, not her illusory one. And the real self belongs to Karenina in marriage. On page 476, the perturbation in Karenina's soul went on increasing, we're told, and reached a point where he gave up struggling against it. The perturbation in his soul. Suddenly he felt that what he had taken for perturbation was, on the contrary, a blissful state of his soul, bringing him joy, such as he had never before known. So this man has been so rational and so much in control of everything that he's never surrendered to joy. And he feels it at first as something just intruding, a perturbation. And then when he recognizes it, it's joy. He was not thinking that the law of Christ, which all his life he had wished to fulfill, told him to forgive and love his enemies, but a joyous feeling of forgiveness and love for his enemies filled his soul. So he isn't just doing what he thinks is right, not trying to act like a Christian, which he's done all his life, but he actually is filled with joy and wants to forgive. So Anna calls Vronsky to them, commands him to uncover his face. So poor Vronsky is the one I feel for in this scene, because he has no rights at all, and he's aware of that. And he's standing with his face in his hands. And she calls her husband a saint in front of him. Karenina pulls Vronsky's hands away from his face, uncovering his terrible look of suffering and shame. "Give him your hand," Anna commands. "Forgive him." Karenina held out his hand. So she's telling her husband to forgive Vronsky. Karenina held out his hand without restraining the tears that were falling. "Thank God, thank God," Anna cries. She goes into a fever and is not expected to come out of it. The two men stay by her. But ironically enough, Anna recovers. See, and that's embarrassing, to say the least. Because she's caused a situation now that she really can't deal with. The exaltation of the nearness of death begins to disappear. And on the third day, the doctors begin giving some hope that she really is going to pull through this. Karenina and Vronsky talk with each other. Karenina informing the younger man that he had intended to divorce Anna. See, but now that he's so loving and kind and forgives her, he's not going to divorce her. And they have come to want the divorce so that they can live in society because they are ostracized as it is. So Karenina says, but I saw her and forgave her, and the joy of forgiving has revealed my duty to me. I have wholly forgiven. I want to turn the other cheek. I want to give my cloak because my coat has been taken. I only pray, God, that the joy of forgiving may not be taken from me. So what he does not see is the terrible self-centeredness of all this. He can't consider others because of the joy that comes from his own virtue. He's not at all conscious of this self-centeredness, and there's no villainy in it. It's just that people can choose what seems a virtuous path out of a spiritual self-interest. And that's what he's done. Karenina goes on to say that he will not desert Anna, will not divorce her, and that if she calls for Vronsky, he will let her know, let him know. So Anna's going to live with her husband, and if she calls for Vronsky, I'll let you know. And now I think it best for you to leave, he says. So ousted from his place of authority with Anna, because Vronsky, was her nearest and dearest, and made aware that he has no rights over her, that indeed this formerly despised husband has all the right on his side, Vronsky shamefacedly beats a retreat. He could not understand Karenina, but felt there was something high and inaccessible to one with his outlook on life. Now, was Anna sincere in her repentance? Is Karenina sincere in his forgiveness? Vronsky is certainly sincere in his shame. His life is ruined from now on. He tries to shoot himself and misses. He's revealed as thoroughly unmanned, rendered incompetent. He's the superfluous man par excellence. His codes are exploded. So Vronsky is, at least in that scene, the chief victim of this terrible disaster. Right to the break. After she recovers, Anna reverts to what she was before her illness. She hates her husband, she says, for his virtues. She's not interested in her new little daughter. She's interested only in Vronsky. And one senses she's interested only in making sure that he still idolizes her and loves her sufficiently. And when you think about all that she's given up, it's virtually impossible for one man to make all that up to her. So it's an impossible task. They can't live in polite society, so she and her lover move to Vronsky's estate outside the city. She gives up her son. They have what they wanted, each other, eternally, every moment of the day. They go to Italy. They think maybe traveling abroad will help, but that's not really very satisfactory. And actually, Tolstoy uses this as an opportunity to show us how shallow they both are. When they talk with an artist, they talk about his talent, and they talk about his technique. And Tolstoy wants us to see that the artist doesn't even know what they're talking about. To him, it's not a matter of talent or technique. It's his work. And so we're meant to read that as a kind of satire on the dabbling that Anna and Vronsky are having to do they don't have a work. And they don't understand someone who does. Vronsky has relinquished, as I've said, his career in the army. All his major interest in life is to be with Anna, and she's beginning to feel that he's bored with her. Now compare Vronsky's ennui with Levin's impatience to get back to his work. For Levin, his restlessness is a temporary thing. For Vronsky, as he's beginning to realize, it's a frighteningly actual way of life. See page 422. Vronsky, meanwhile, in spite of the complete fulfillment of what he had so long desired, was not completely happy. He soon felt that the realization of his longing gave him only one grain of the mountain of bliss that he had anticipated. That realization showed him the eternal error that men make by imagining that happiness consists in the gratification of their wishes. When first he united his life with hers and donned civilian clothes, he felt the delight of freedom in general, such as he had not before known, and also the freedom of love. He was contented then, but not for long. Soon he felt rising in his soul a desire for desires. And that particular kind of ennui is frightening because there seems to be no remedy for it. It's a boredom that reaches to the core of a person, a desire for desires. He didn't want anything. So involuntarily he began to snatch at every passing caprice, mistaking it for a desire and a purpose. And so what we see is a man's work, and his career in the army was serious. A man's work gets turned into hobbies, And this is the terrible thing that can happen, because a hobby's not a work. And particularly when you're still young, as Vronsky is. So notice how keen this analysis is. But all of this psychological analysis that Tolstoy is giving us is not, as the psychologist Jung has pointed out, the kind that psychologists are interested in. I wanted to tell you what Jung has to say about two kinds of novels: the psychological and the visionary. And I think this is a kind of important difference. The psychological novel traces the workings of someone's mind, their feelings, makes very clear that inferiority of a person. The other kind of novel Jung calls visionary. This is in an essay called Psychology and Literature. And he says in the visionary novel, everyday reality is broken into and something strange erupts that you didn't expect. And he says psychologists are not interested in this kind of novel. They're not interested in the psychological novel, because the work's already been done for them. See, and this is what we have mostly with our great British tradition of the novel. It analyzes so clearly and well the characters and their thoughts, the way their minds work, that the psychologist doesn't feel there's any kind of mystery or any kind of work to be done. But in the visionary novel, he says, something comes out of the hinterland, out of the abyss, and has to be interpreted. Now, I take it that this is the kind of novelist Dostoevsky is, and this is the kind Tolstoy is. And it seems to me Tolstoy is the best of the psychological novelists. He's extremely good at it. But he makes everything so clear. You see, Vronsky's boredom. There's not much that a psychologist could do further than what Tolstoy has done. Whereas Dostoevsky gives you strangeness and mysteries and the grotesque and uninterpretable things. Things that you can build all kinds of weird theories about. You know, think back at that. We never did even talk about. There was so much in Dostoevsky we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about that strange dream of Ippolit. Do you remember when that kind of insect, lizard, he dreams about that creature that's in his room, that's exuding a kind of white fluid, and it's crawling up the walls, and he thinks it's gone and it's behind him, and it's reaching out, and one of its tentacles is, and so, how do you interpret that dream? You know, what? It's meant to mean something, obviously. And just at the end of it, Rogozhin walks in. And yet the dream seems in some way connected with Mishkin. I tried to do something with that white fluid in Mishkin, but I didn't get anywhere. So this is the difference, you see, is that Dostoevsky gives you something strange, and you get clues to it, and you can work it out, but it's not immediately apparent. Whereas Tolstoy gives us such a beautifully clear exposition of the way the mind works, the way Anna's mind works, and the way Vronsky's does. And he's so wise. But you know, that first kind of novel, the psychological, doesn't tell us anything we didn't already know. Now, we might not have, couldn't have put it that well. And we might not have ever quite confronted it. But it's something we really knew. We know that people ought not behave the way Anna and Vronsky are behaving, you know. We know that it would have terrible consequences for the husband. So all of these things, they're done so beautifully. And we have that joy of seeing something confirmed that we already knew. Now, Anna's husband is somewhat puzzling, but not in the way that Dostoevsky's writings are. And so we go back to Dostoevsky's writings and keep trying to interpret Mishkin and to understand what that inverse marriage was at the end when the bride is murdered. And we know it's fearfully important. So Dostoevsky's novels stay with you as icons in the mind that you keep working at all your life, if you ever really take them in. Whereas if you're not careful with Tolstoy, and this isn't fair to him, but if you're not careful, Tolstoy's novels will kind of turn into moral platitudes for us. And so we have to keep reminding us of how great an artist he is. But he's speaking of those verities that we really, really already knew. Part of the difference in the two is that there's such extreme differences, but one of the major ones is that Dostoevsky has a narrator who's limited, whereas Tolstoy has an omniscient narrator. Tolstoy can tell you everything because he can get into everyone's mind. But Dostoevsky's work is all hearsay. It's someone who's thought about the story and talked to people and tells us what he can. He can record conversations and look at people closely, but he can't get at them, inside them. So it's the difference in this angle of narration, more than anything else, that distinguishes the two authors. And certainly on your final, I'm going to give you one of the questions will be a comparison of the two. Because I think we've had just the brothers Karamazov and Anna Karenina since midterm, haven't we? Did we cover the devils at midterm?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you have two huge, let's see, what was it William James called them? Some kind of monsters. Loose baggy monsters. Mm-hmm. So you have two loose baggy monsters to deal with on the final exam. So you need to be thinking about how very different their approach to their subject is. But back to Tolstoy and his wisdom, because it is wisdom, and Vronsky and his ennui. According to Tolstoy, what is it that Vronsky misses? The masculine life he had been living in the army, society, his freedom. He was suited for a glamorous affair with all intrigue, but not for marriage. And Tolstoy makes us see pretty clearly the intensity of romantic love based on passion, and makes us see that it can't last. It can't last because it wears people out. It's not entirely human. It presupposes two angels or two demons, not ordinary human beings with ordinary things that they have to do, work that they must pursue, and who can, at moments, achieve this absolute transcendence that the other kind of love thinks is easy to achieve. Now, why is this sort of passionate love destructive? Because it's founded on delusion, requiring constant effort to make its intensity and its pretense the whole of life. The male is captured by it. He's taken away from his normal pursuits. We see developing in such a relationship the masculine ennui. And men get bored when they're around women too long. Now, women don't get bored in the same way. They simply want men to talk more. But because marriage is a work together, that ennui of the honeymoon soon passes within a marriage. Levin is kind of bored with his long honeymoon. He loves Kitty very much, but he needs to get back to his work. Life has to be resumed. And love becomes a support, a joining in work, a context for one's work, a framework for viewing all of reality, but not a full-time occupation in itself. So what Tolstoy is doing in this novel is showing us on every level the resiliency and indissolubility of marriage, its effect on oneself, one's mate, on the children, on the household, the response to it by society, that instinctive protection that's given it by the community, even by shallow people, based on the recognition that some actions are destructive and hence dangerous for society, and that marriage is at the base of society. Now, this is the 19th century. That, what is it today? It's different. Is there still that deep-lying sense that marriage is kind of the basis of society? So some other actions that are just as sinful or just as shocking are overlooked. Some of us may be sufficiently postmodern to hold the view that all norms for behavior are of human origin, and that only the individual should be considered in moral issues. And if so, after we finish the novel and have seen empathetically what Tolstoy is saying, we can go back to what we think. But we cannot read this novel pretty well unless we give up our preconceptions. And we have to do that with other writers too. I differ with Tolstoy on many points, but that doesn't keep me from seeing the genius that he is and from appreciating the art piece that is Anna Karenina. Now, we're certainly free to make distinctions and to evaluate a writer's whole vision, but while we are taking the work into our imaginations, we have to accept it with negative capability and appreciate the profound and complicated study of human behavior that it provides. Remember that Aristotle said that poetry is truer than history, since history tells us what has happened, whereas literature tells us what ought to happen. But it has to be a genuine work of art to do so. And that's what education is all about, of course, developing the ability to tell the genuine from the pretentious. Tolstoy's novel is a genuinely great work of art, and so we do need to learn from it. Tolstoy's wisdom is about the way in which society operates. Now, one thing the novel has done that the great dramas did not do, one way the novel has enlarged our understanding of reality is to give us, see, here's your central action, this is your plot, moving, and around that is what is called the enveloping action. And it's not just the setting, but it's an action. See, it's the action of society, it's the action of culture. And the novel is concerned with that very much. For instance, we certainly see in this novel the two cities. Moscow is the old city, traditional, agrarian, pious, old-fashioned. Petersburg is the new westernized city with the layers of society and the sophisticated leaders of society. And so all the way through this novel, Tolstoy is contrasting those two cities. And he focuses on the problem of how do you get a daughter married in an old-fashioned city that is beginning to change. And so this novel is situated right at a time of cultural change. And Levin's agrarian reforms and his concern with all that's going on politically is part of the enveloping action of the novel. And so whatever novels you read, pay attention to the enveloping action, because this is as much an important part of the author's art as that central plot is. So Tolstoy's wisdom is about the way in which society operates. He's awfully wise in it. The invisible forms by which it shows its approval or its disapproval. A lesser woman than Anna could get by with violating society's codes. But because she's an innately truthful person, and because she's always been a leader, she thinks she can show herself to society for what she truly is. She doesn't want to pretend. She doesn't want to be a hypocrite. She's wrong. What recourse does Tolstoy show us that society possesses concerning violations of which it disapproves? Coolness, a lack of invitations to social affairs, gossip, and if necessary, the outright snub. And this is Anna's shocking experience at the opera, which you'll read about next time. Now, one thing I meant to talk about that I didn't is I wanted you to compare Levin's boredom after he's been married about 3 months
He wants to get back to work. And this is a natural kind of boredom. With Vronsky's boredom, which is that terrible ennui. And that French word describes a boredom that's constantly turning from one thing to another, hunting for something to be interested in, because the boredom is of the soul. And so the decline that we see in this novel that's so terrifying and pitiable is the decline in Vronsky. Because though he was not a strong man before, he was a decent man. A man as he thought of honor. And Anna's death is tragic, whereas Vronsky's seems merely pitiable. All right, you finish the novel for next time. I'll have your papers back then. I'll have some advice about how to prepare for the final, and I'll find out if there's any way to have the final at a more civilized time.